Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. History of Palestine, Part 2, the pre-Islamic era. I would like to start with one question, why it's important to study history. And the very straightforward answer would be that Allah ordered us to do so. In this verse, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِ كَانَ أَكْثَرُهُم مُشْرِكِينَ. Say, O Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, travel in the land and see what the end of those before you. Most of them were mushrikeen, the disbelievers in the oneness of Allah, the polytheists, idolaters, etc. Allah ordered us to study the lives of the people before us. This is history. Also in the ayah, Allah said most of those people were mushrikeen, meaning that we need to study not only our history, but other nations' history. And this came in Surah Ar-Rum, which is named after a pagan empire existed before Islam. Another reason why to study history is understanding the history of ancient Palestine is pivotal to understand the ongoing conflicts. Better knowledge is mandatory. Learning history also makes us wiser. We start to understand the laws of society, what controls human behavior, and what are the consequences for every action. Knowing this will make us able to have an impact in our future. After the death of Solomon, the whole kingdom was divided into two states, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah in around 931 BC. And we'll start seeing a pattern in history that division is always the beginning of the end. In 722 BC, we've learned before in the previous lecture that Samaria, the capital of the northern state of Israel, was invaded by the Assyrians. By this invasion, 10 tribes living in the state of Israel gradually vanished from history. Just a quick reminder, there were 12 tribes in 12 Jewish tribes. 10 of them chose to live in the northern state of Israel, and only 2 of them, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, chose to live in the southern state, which was the state that had Jerusalem as the capital. What happened to the northern 10 tribes after the Assyrian invasion was very peculiar in history. They assimilated and lost their identity and were eventually called the 10 lost tribes of Israel. From now on, when we're talking about the Jews, we talk only about the Jews that represent the 2 tribes, the 2 left tribes, the Judah tribe and the Benjamin tribe. Of course, there were a few from the Levites tribe, but the Levites tribe were mainly the tribes of the priests. All the priests in the Jewish history came from the Levites. But this is a very important lesson in history. People who denied their identity, people who did not stick to their identity, they are very amenable to be assimilated in history. They are very amenable to be lost. They are very amenable to be forgotten in history. And this is what happened to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah, governed by the lineage of David, lasted almost 200 years more. By the year 587, which is dark part of the Jewish history, the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem, and their leader was the infamous Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem was razed to the ground, and more importantly, the temple that was built by Solomon was destroyed, and the Jews were exiled to Babylon, where they were enslaved and lived in captivity. That's why this part of the Jewish history is called Babylonian captivity. This period lasted for almost 50 years, until the Persians conquered Babylon. Cyrus the Great, in the year 538, invaded Babylon and was able to conquer Babylon. He issued a decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, effectively granting them the state of self-governed province in the Persian Empire. This strategy was designed to secure the loyalty of his new citizens by honoring their cultural and religious customs. Another lesson, there is difference between the Babylonian and Persians, tolerance versus oppression. We will learn in history that states who practice tolerance with different people, with diversity, they usually last longer, whereas states that practice oppression, usually they do not last long in history. And the example here is the Babylonians versus the Persians. However, after the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, it took them 70 years to recover after they were released from captivity. Some authors claim that the reason for that was that most of the Jews actually preferred to stay back in Babylon. They were used to living there. Only the religious Jews were keen to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Again, the history is telling us it is the people who stick to their beliefs, the people who stick to their traditions, the people who stick to their identity are the people who are able to rebuild their nations. So in 458 BC, it was Ezra, a priest according to the Jews, who started building the second temple after being in ruins for almost 150 years. This marked the era of the second temple in the Jewish history. Though living under foreign rule, the Jews were able to relatively live safe and were able to practice religion without a lot of interference as long as they were complying with the state rules and paying their taxes. However, 100 years later, the Persian Empire invaded by Alexander the Great, one of the very unique leaders in history, actually one of the greatest in the human history. This made some scholars, in very short period of time, he was able to invade huge, vast areas of land, all Persia, Egypt, Macedonia, and most of Turkey. And this made some of the scholars to believe that he might be Zulqarnain, who was mentioned in the Quran. But there is no historical proof for for this. And according to the historical evidence we have, Alexander the Great was polytheist. So he was not monotheist. He was not worshiping God, one God. But again, history is not very accurate most of the time. So we cannot account for that. This did not affect the Jews because they practiced the same ruling rules as the Persians, with tolerance towards the Jews, allowing them to rule with their own style, to practice the religion, and to just pay taxes to the state, and that should be they need to do to the state. Alexander the Great died very shortly after very period time of ruling. He died at the age of 32, and when he died, he had no descendant. His son was just an infant. So his empire was divided between his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I, ruled Egypt and created the Ptolemaic kingdom, and Seleucid, the other general, created the Seleucid kingdom that engulfed most of Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. If we take a closer look, we'll find that the lands of ancient Palestine, Judah, and Jerusalem were right at the border between Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires. This means that with any friction or change in tides, which we know from history happens a lot, the fate of Judah and Jerusalem and the ancient Palestine will change consequently. Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires had 5 wars across 100 years between 300 and 200 BC called Syrian Wars, and those wars were on who will rule the land of ancient Palestine. In the end, however, the Seleucid Empire won the war and gained control over Judah and Jerusalem. Both Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires were polytheist, yet they were tolerant towards Jews, and they granted them freedom of religion and worship in their temple, as long as they are paying taxes. However, the Seleucid Empire was a bit different than Ptolemaic. Seleucid Empire was larger, and it has direct borders with growing Roman Empire, and this made the Seleucid Empire involved in a lot of wars, and wars are expensive, and expenses are usually covered by taxes, and that made the Jewish people in Jerusalem, in old Palestine, unhappy. Another thing that happened, and it's really important to point, is that the living situation for the Jews in Seleucid Empire was a bit different. The Seleucid Empire, as well as the Ptolemaic Empire, were predominantly Greek empires. They were adopting heavily the Greek culture. Of course, the elite people in the Jewish society in old Palestine, in Jerusalem and Judah, especially the elite of them, they wanted to imitate the rulers. So they dressed like Greeks, they named themselves like Greek names, and they slowly started to infuse their culture and their behaviors with the Greek culture. And of course, we know the Greek culture is a polytheist culture. On the other hand, poorer people, the people in the lower levels of the society, were called traditional Jews. They stick more to the Jewish traditions and teachings of the Torah. So now there's some division happening inside the Jewish community under the Seleucid ruling. But again, the Jewish were not very happy whether they were Hellenizers, that Greek Jews, or the traditional Jews, because they had to pay a lot of taxes. So they took an advantage of an event that happened during the ruling of Antiochus IV, one of the very famous Seleucid emperors. He was in a war with the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and there was a rumor that he was killed. And as soon as the Jewish people heard that he was killed, they started to revolt, and they ousted the highest priest that was appointed by Antiochus IV. And of course, this was the main benefit for that, is to avoid the taxes burden that was put on their shoulder by the Seleucid Empire. But unfortunately for them, Antiochus IV was not killed, and this was a rumor. On his way back, defeated from Egypt, he was not in the best mood, and he decided to make the Jewish pay. So he destroyed the walls of Jerusalem, he put restrictions on the Jewish religion practices, and turned their temple into a temple of Zeus. He was trying to subjugate the Jews, but this actually did not work, because this incited the Maccabees revolt in 167 BC. This is one of the very important chapters in the history of Jewish people in ancient Palestine. The second temple has been acquisited by the Seleucids and has been desecrated by pagan idols. Also, they were now prevented from practicing the religious rituals. So the Maccabees revolt was led by a priest called Mattathias, a very famous name in the Jewish history, who was called the Maccabi. And the Maccabi in Aramaic means the hammer, a sign of strength. This was a Jewish rebellion against the Seleucid Empire and its Hellenistic influence, particularly under the king Antiochus IV. The Maccabees gained a lot of popularity within the Jews for obvious reasons. They quickly managed to gather the Jews in a fairly large army and started a guerrilla warfare on the Seleucid Empire. They managed to win several battles on far larger and well-organized armies. In 3 years, they managed to reacquire Jerusalem again and enter the temple and cleanse the temple from the pagan idols. It is this event that the Jewish festival of Hanukkah commemorates every year, starting from the year 164 BC. Lighting the menorah is practiced to revive the memory of the reacquisition of the temple. This was the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is for the first time for centuries allowed the Jews to be independent at 142 BC. The Hasmonean ruling lasted only for 70 years. Because in 63 BC, now growing going out of control. The Roman Empire was expanding at the expense of the Seleucid Empire. In 63 BC, the Roman commander Pompey conquered Jerusalem, now acquiring the territories of the Seleucid Empire. You see, this is a pattern in history. One thing that we learn from the old Palestine history is history keeps repeating itself. So far, we can count 5 empires taking possession of the old land of Palestine: Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Seleucid, and now is the turn for the Roman Empire to take control. It's a general rule that we've learned from Quran, and when we look in history, we find what consolidates this rule. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. This is Allah saying in Ali Imran, verse number 40, such days of varying fortunes we give to people by turns. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, lesson from history. There are, however, rules to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets the stage for those changes. Rise and fall of nations follows a specific pattern. Strength and power starts when the mission is clear in the minds of the people of any nation. Success and ruling results. This is typically followed by division and internal fighting. Multiple small states result, like what happened in Solomon's kingdom. Then internal corruption, marked by increased taxes and turning on own values, like religion in the case of the Jews, marks the final phase of the nation, where typically stronger, younger nations taking their turn will conquer the older ones and so forth. Now back to Judah and ancient Palestine. Romans now ruled the lands. Initially, they didn't oppress the Jews, allowed them to live in Jerusalem and practice the rituals, followed the same rules as before, like the Seleucids, allowed them to practice the rituals, appointed a high priest from the Jews, and collected taxes. From that point on, until the 7th century, Rome will rule these lands. Soon, however, there were several revolts, wars between Jews and Romans. In 66 AD, this was the first Jewish-Roman war that was between the Jews in the Judea province in the Roman Empire and the stronger Roman army. As a result of this war, in the year 70 AD, the Emperor Titus entered Jerusalem after conquering the city, burned the walls, and more importantly, burned the Second Temple. And this was the end of the Second Temple. Large number of the Jews were killed, and most of the remaining Jews were captured and taken to Rome as slaves. Some of them managed to escape to Mesopotamia, parts of Iraq and Iran. Jews were exiled once again, and this marks the beginning of the diaspora of the Jews. From this point on, the Jews started migration to several areas in the Old World. Those who went to German, France were called Ashkenazi. Those who went to Spain, Portugal were called Sephardic. Those who went to Yemen were called Mizrahi, and so forth. After the capture of Jerusalem, what happened to Old Palestine land? Jerusalem was almost destructed. The Romans decided to build another city on the ruins of Jerusalem. This city was called Aliyah Capitolina, or Aliyah in Arabic. It will be known by this name till the Islamic conquest more than 550 years afterwards. Aliyah, or previous Jerusalem, remained a pagan city up until the year 312, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and the city changed into a Christian city. It remained like this with very few Jews inside and outside the city up until the opening of the city by Islam in the year 638 or 16 Hijri. Before I reach the final part of the presentation, let's pause a little to see what we've learned so far. So what do we learn from the Jewish history in Judah and Palestine? They were people of faith. They were blessed from Allah and were chosen by Allah to carry His message and spread righteousness to this world. They, however, misused this privilege and thought they were entitled and the preferred sons of God, the chosen people. They didn't want to carry the true burden of being chosen and to spread the words of Allah to mankind. They rather excluded everyone else who was not an Israelite and considered them as inferior people, unworthy of Allah's mercy. How perverted this concept is. And when they went astray and disobeyed Allah's commands and gave their prophets and messengers hard time, Allah gave them a chance after chance and sent them more prophets. At one point of time, they had 3 of the greatest prophets at the same time in the same location with the same message: Zechariah, Yahya or John, and Isa or Jesus, peace be upon all of them. So what happened? The elites of them disregarded those messages and collaborated with the polytheists, the Romans, because they didn't want to let go of the luxury life. They tried to kill all of them. They succeeded in killing 2 of them, and the third, Jesus alayhi salam, was raised to heaven, and they crucified another man thinking that he was Jesus. So actually they thought they killed all of them. They gathered them. The righteous who followed those prophets were actually hailed upon in Quran, and we as Muslims think highly of them, al-Hawariyin, the followers of Jesus, of Isa alayhi salam. They gathered themselves and started spreading the words of Allah to everyone without restrictions, including every human in their mission. Them and their followers were granted success for some time. However, the decision came from Allah that the Israelites will not be blessed with any more prophets or messengers. For the next 600 years or more, there were no more prophets. All people of faith, Jews and Christians, were waiting for the coming messenger. They were told this in their holy books, but they were not expecting expecting him to come from outside the Jews, since all previous prophets were from them. But to their surprise, he came from the lineage of Ismail, the other son of Abraham, from the Arabs. He was Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know what happened next. The people of the book, Jews and Christians, were split into two big groups. People who embraced the message of Allah and became Muslims. Most of the modern Muslims in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt are actually their ancestors, their descendants. The other group, however, rejected the Prophet ﷺ and decided to fight the new rising state, which is a common practice when two big kingdoms, empires are side by side. We learned this from history. Muslims fought back for their freedom and for the freedom of the subjugated people as they were ordered. And all praise to Allah, they were victorious. In the year 638, after the Battle of Yarmouk, one of the biggest battles in its time, all Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem were now yielding to the ruling of the young, strong state, the Islamic State. The highest priest of Jerusalem, Sophronius, did put one condition to give away the keys of Jerusalem. His condition was to give the keys to the caliph of the Muslims, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. Umar radiallahu anhu rode all the way to Al-Quds, as it will be called by Muslims since then, an Arabic word for sacred. He was alternating with his servant during his ride. Each of them rides for an hour and walks for 2, giving the camel an hour of rest with each round. By the time they arrived to the gates of Jerusalem, it was the servant's turn to ride. Umar, being one of the most just people in human history, refused to break the rule and insisted on walking, guiding the camel while the servant was on the top of the camel. The whole Byzantine Christians were waiting on top of the walls of the city to see the caliph, the leader, the commander-in-chief of all these armies that managed to conquer the biggest 2 empires in the world in such a short time. And instead of finding a caravan, they found only a man and his servant on his foot, walking, wearing simple clothes, while his armies are waiting, besieging the very city he is about to enter. The stories go on and tell us that the highest priest of Jerusalem, Sophronius, was not surprised as his companions were, because he knew from their books that Jerusalem will be open to a man with the same description, walking on his feet, wearing simple clothes. The greatest message we can get from this story is that doing your best and succeeding in fulfilling the commands of Allah doesn't need any prerequisites of wealth, health, or plenty of resources. You have to use whatever you have, and if you have a clear goal and follow the laws that Allah has set in this world, you will achieve the goal. Sophronius gave Omar the golden keys of Jerusalem. He led him into a tour inside the city. He took him to the church of the Holy Sepulchre. While he's inside the church, prayer time arrived. He asked the priest, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, asked the priest, "Where can I pray?" The priest told him, "Pray here." Umar, however, refused. He was worried that the Muslims after him will believe that it's the right to pray in this church and might turn it into a mosque, violating the rights given to Christians to practice the religion in a place they built for this purpose. He went a distance outside the church and prayed in the open using his coat as a praying mat. And as he expected, radiallahu anhu, years later, this site was used to build a mosque, Al-Masjid Al-Umari in Al-Quds. This concludes my story, a story full of lessons, story that was made brief due to time constraints. I urge you to read, contemplate about these lessons, and ask if you have any questions. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh, for the presentation. If anyone has some questions, go ahead and ask him. Meanwhile, I'll be working on getting the Kahoot up and running.